Good evening.
Good evening.
7:03, not bad. Welcome to the Bartow History Museum and the Booth Western Art Museum. My name is Trey Gaines. I'm director of the Bartow History Museum, and we're thrilled to have you out here this evening for this great lecture program we're having for you. Thank you also for coming out in such great numbers that made us move to a larger venue. So we're glad to have a good crowd tonight. We want to say thank you to the Booth Museum, too, for having us in their facility, for letting us use the theater tonight. And we also give a big shout out, let's give a big round of applause to Craig and Scott Painter, Craig Knight and Scott Painter from Scott's Walk Up Barbecue, who supplied our barbecue. When you have an opportunity to patronize them again, do so and thank them for being here tonight. Now, usually when I do our evening lecture welcomes, I give a litany of upcoming programs and events, but I want Jim to have adequate time tonight, so I'm going to bypass that and let him have as much time as he's going to need. But I do want to say that if you want information about upcoming programs and events, of which we have many, those of you that are members of the museum, you get our regular mailings, you know that we're busy and we want you to be a part of all that. Be sure to get some information about those events at our front desk. Follow us on our website or our social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're not difficult to find and get information about. Following tonight's presentation, I do invite all of you back to the Bartow History Museum for a book signing, and we're holding dessert hostage. So if you want cookie and coffee and more something to drink, come back to the museum, the History Museum, with us and enjoy the rest of the evening with us. Let me go ahead and introduce our speaker now. Jim Auchmutey spent almost 30 years as a writer and editor for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, specializing in stories about the South and its history and culture. He was twice named the Cox Newspaper Chain's Writer of the Year and was honored by the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Awards, the Associated Press, and the Sigma Delta Chi Journalism Society. Jim has written extensively about food. He has co-authored 2 cookbooks, including the first devoted solely to barbecue sauces and rubs, called the Ultimate Barbecue Sauce Cookbook. He is a founding member of the Southern Foodways Alliance at the University of Mississippi and has won awards for his food writing from the James Beard Foundation and the Association of Food Journalists. He was a guest curator for the Atlanta History Center's Barbecue Nation exhibition, which inspired his latest book, the book we're here to hear about tonight, Smokelore, A Short History of Barbecue in America. The exhibition will be open through September 29th at the Atlanta History Center, and I encourage you to go check it out. A native Georgian, Jim comes from a long line of barbecue pitmasters and Brunswick stew makers. He lives in Atlanta with his wife Pam, who's an editor at Emory University. Please join me in welcoming Jim Auchmutey.
Thank you very much, Trey. And thank you so much for inviting me to come here and speak. I have to admit that when I was doing this book, knowing my family's roots here in Bartow County and my lineage of pitmasters here, that the thought had occurred to me that this would be a great venue. But y'all beat me to it and invited me here before I could even approach you, and that was very, very special to me. I'd also like to add my thanks to Scott's Walk Up Barbecue for the food tonight. That was so good. I really do love that barbecue place. My brother Chuck here and I come up every Christmas time and put a wreath on our grandparents' graves out at Harley Presbyterian Church Cemetery. And we almost always end that little jaunt by going by Scott's and having lunch. Then we go back to Chuck's house in Ackworth and watch the SEC championship game. So it's a nice little tradition that we put together. So let me tell you a little bit about the book and how I came to do it. Like Trey was saying, I am a native Atlanta, and I worked at the Journal-Constitution as a reporter and editor for almost 30 years. I was never a food writer as such, but I always liked writing about food because it gives you such a clear window into our culture. And of all the foods I've written about, barbecue is the nearest and dearest to me, probably because of my family background here in Bartow County. Smokelore is not a cookbook or a barbecue travelogue or an academic study, although it has elements of all of those. It's a popular history with 50,000 words of text, 26 recipes, and 208 pieces of artwork, some of which I'll show you tonight. The book is a companion volume to the exhibition that Trey mentioned, Barbecue Nation, which is at view on at the Atlanta History Center at Buckhead through the end of September. And there we go. There were billboards all over town when that thing opened up last spring, and it was actually supposed to close after about a year, but they extended its run by several months. And last time I was over at the History Center, they told me they might extend the run again because it's been very popular. So if you haven't seen it, please go see it. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoyed curating it. But I tell you, between curating an exhibition like this and writing the book, the companion book, I probably had a more up-close experience with barbecue over a 5-year period than is healthy for one. My thesis in Smokelore is simple. I believe that barbecue is the most truly American food because it is so intertwined with our history and involves so many of the ethnic threads that make up this country. Barbecue epitomizes us. We embrace it. There's a reason why the 4th of July is so associated with barbecues. As a reporter and frequent food writer at the AJC, I wrote about barbecue from time to time, following in a long tradition of Southern journalists who like to weigh in on the subject. Oop. There we go. That's Ralph McGill, the Pulitzer Prize winning editor back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s of the Atlanta Constitution. Ralph McGill is best remembered as a person who spoke out about civil rights and things like that and took a lot of brave stands. But he also was a native Tennessean who loved Southern food and Southern culture and wrote a lot about Southern food in his column, including barbecue several times. This silly photo is from 1949. It shows Ralph McGill in the kitchenette at the Atlanta Constitution offices in downtown Atlanta, where he sometimes whipped up lunch for the editorial board. He had written an article for the Saturday Evening Post in 1949 titled, "What's Wrong with Southern Cooking?" And they made him pose in this chef's hat, which I don't imagine he wore day to day around the editorial board very much. But in the article, McGill complained about the bad barbecue motorists encountered as they drove south for vacations. Quote, "What the average tourist gets is something which rests on the stomach like a fricassee made of old political campaign speeches." I mentioned McGill because in 1942, McGill attended a big public barbecue in Bartow County, the Uharli Farmers Club barbecue, and wrote about it in his column. He praised the pork and the Brunswick stew, said they were authentic and honest. I'm glad he liked them because my grandfather, Charles Robert Auchmutey Sr., helped make that barbecue. Daddy Bob, as the family knew him, was a noted pitmaster who cooked at community gatherings around Bartow. In 1954, another Southern journalist attended the Uharli Farmers Club barbecue and used it as a centerpiece for an article he wrote, also in the Saturday Evening Post, titled "Dixie's Most Disputed Dish." My grandfather was featured prominently in that article. That is him. There we go, right there. That's Bob Auchmutey overseeing the pits at the Uharli Farmers Club barbecue. This story ran in July the 4th, 1954, so I imagine this was at the Uharli Farmers Club barbecue in 1953. It's usually in August. There had been a long tradition in my family of making barbecue and Brunswick stew. My great-grandfather, James Robert Auchmutey, for whom I am named, ran a grist mill on Uharli Creek and ran pits at community barbecues around Bartow County in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The grist mill he ran is now Tilly Mill. The Auchmutey family ran it in the late 1800s, and then my great-grandfather died in 1924. The Tillys rather later ran it and now own it and let people come and do picnics and weddings and things there. It's a beautiful, beautiful spot. I'm so glad there's part of the mill is still there and we get to sort of feel that vibe. But my great-grandfather, James Robert, it's funny, we don't have a photo of him, but we do have his Brunswick stew recipe. which kind of shows you where the priorities were in that family. Now his son, my grandfather, Daddy Bob, the fellow in that picture there, he followed in his footsteps and ran barbecues around here in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. My father kept a diary for 4 or 5 years while he was in Barry College, just before World War II. In his diary, which I read for the first time just about 2 years ago, he mentioned his father cooking barbecues about 10 times in that diary. And this is my favorite mention. This is from July the 4th, 1941, where the big red arrow is. Daddy Bob had cooked the barbecue for the Bartow County Sheriff in a 4th of July barbecue in Cartersville. And my father's quote is that he got $16.85 for it too. Wow. Often when Daddy mentions these barbecues his father was cooking, it's because he's getting to take home Brunswick stew to Barry, and he lives on it for 2 or 3 days. But after that story ran in the Saturday Evening Post in 1954, Bob Auchmutey got a lot of invitations to cook barbecues all over the place. And he became, you know, a sort of minor celebrity because of that write-up. This is a picture that I've shown some of y'all here, and I've shown around up here, and that Trey was good enough to share with some people on social media. This is a picture that shows my grandfather's pit crew. We think it's 1956, possibly early 1957. That's my grandfather there, of course, looking like the man from American Gothic, with that menacing butcher knife there. That's my Uncle Earl Auchmutey over there with a little smirk on his face. Uncle Earl was a jokester. He sometimes, when he would come and visit us in Atlanta, he was a career Air Force officer in Warner Robins, after this picture. And when he would come and visit us in Atlanta, he would sometimes stop at Fresh Air Barbecue or Stodchill's Barbecue, 2 great old barbecue places down around Jackson. And he would bring us barbecue from those places. And Earl was a jokester. And he was the one who usually would tell you dirty jokes to the guys. So I tell the people at Fresh Air this, that you're my favorite barbecue in Georgia because I associate you with dirty jokes. Now, the reason I've circulated this photo actually is because I don't know who 3 of the men in this photo are. I don't know who these 2 fellows are. I took it to the Harley Farmers Club barbecue last year, and several members of the Nelson family looked at it and said, well, we think that might be a Nelson, but we're not sure which one. And so I'm not sure. 1 or 2 of those might be Nelsons. I really don't know. This fellow right here, I don't know his actual name, but I'm 98% certain that he was a farmer who lived near where the Auchmuteys lived out in New Harley and was one of my grandfather's closest friends. And in the family, they knew him as Preach Wilson. I know Preach had a proper first name, but I'm not really sure of it. I would love to find out who all these other gentlemen are. If you have any ideas about that, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to talk to these people. I kind of like I want to deconstruct this photo. For some reason, it's kind of important to me. Now, one of the invitations that my grandfather took, which is one of the biggest adventures of his life, he and some buddies from Cartersville drove up in 2 cars with a bunch of Brunswick stew pots and other paraphernalia to Chicago and cooked a barbecue up there for 2,000 people in suburban Chicago. And when they got back, it was such a deal that he was interviewed by the Tribune, the paper here. And they ran a story based on an interview with Bob Auchmutey about their trip. And get a load of this. Rebels cooked Southern Q in very midst of Yankee land. That is just, I know that's a tongue-in-cheek headline, but nonetheless, my friends from the North, when they see that, they just like, well, I got 2 or 3 friends in Chicago who look at that and say, we're not Yankees, we're in Chicago. Yankees are in New England. But I get, they're all Yankees to us down here, I guess. I love that clip. So let's talk a little bit about the subject of my book, The History of Barbecue. What is barbecue exactly? Some Southerners like to joke about people up north who think this is barbecue. Well, it certainly isn't what we in the Deep South think of as barbecue. But the Kansas City Barbecue Society, the world's largest barbecue organization, takes an ecumenical view of these matters. When they were organized in the 1980s, they had to choose between taking a restrictive fundamentalist view of barbecue or a very tolerant, inclusive one. And they decided to welcome everyone into the tent. Whether you like it or not, barbecue, as a practical matter, is whatever people smoke or grill and elect to call barbecue. So how did this food become so identified with America, and particularly with the South? Well, barbecue is a universal cooking technique that appears in many guises around the globe. We have a unique take on it in this part of the Western Hemisphere. The story begins in the Caribbean with one of the first encounters between Europeans and the indigenous people living there, the Native Americans. In 1493, during Columbus's second voyage, the Spanish sailors observed the Taino people on the shore of Cuba cooking fish and lizards on a framework of sticks over a fire. They translated the native word for the device they were cooking on as a barbacoa. And in the next century or so, that eventually got anglicized as barbecue. This is what we think those early barbacoas looked like. Very simple. It's just a grill suspended over a fire or over smoke. This watercolor is very significant historically. It's by John White, the founder of the Lost Colony in North Carolina. John White came over, founded that colony. He was an artist. He did watercolors of everything that he observed in North Carolina, including the way these natives were cooking on this. And then he went back to England, and then when he came back, the colony had disappeared. But barbacoas like this were a very common cooking technique among the native people in the mainland of North America, in the islands of the Caribbean, and in northern South America. That's where the word comes from. That's where this New World tradition of barbecue, that's where its roots are. But it didn't become barbecue as we think of it until the Spanish brought the first cows and pigs to the New World. Then the English came and colonized North America, and they brought Africans here in slavery, and all of these people had a hand in creating barbecue, which first appeared on the North American mainland in Virginia and the Carolinas. This is a roadside marker near Sanford, North Carolina for the Barbecue Presbyterian Church. These people didn't worship pork. The founders of this church in the 1750s merely thought the mist rising off the swamps in the area looked like barbecue smoke. In other words, barbecue by the mid-1700s was already common enough to be used as a metaphor and a place name. One of the best examples of America's oldest barbecue style is this barbecue restaurant in Ayden, North Carolina, called the Skylight Inn. They smoke whole hogs in the very old tradition, and they use a sauce that has no tomatoes in it. It's a spicy vinegar sauce that you still find mostly in eastern North Carolina. They have been in the barbecue business in various ways going back to the 1830s, the family that runs this place. That Capitol dome on top of the restaurant is a more recent affectation. A journalist told the owner of the restaurant that he regarded North Carolina as the capital of barbecue. And the owner, who apparently had the soul of a folk artist, had a Capitol dome built atop the restaurant. And it's a much photographed sight in barbecue travels. And they are very traditionalist at this place. Across from that Capitol dome, they've got a billboard up that says, "If it's not cooked with wood, it's not barbecue. Upholding a family tradition of wood-cooked barbecue since 1830. That's a great place. If you ever get up 50 or 60 miles east of Raleigh, go to the Skylight Inn. It's one of the best barbecue places in America. Over the decades, of course, barbecue spread to other places around the country. This sign, which it took y'all a little while to read it, This is the House Park Barbecue Restaurant in Austin, Texas. In Texas, of course, cows were more plentiful than pigs, so that became the protein that they barbecued. That was their chosen meat. Texas barbecue is like a world unto itself. They've got elements of southern barbecue there. They've got cowboy open range cooking. They've got Mexican barbacoa and goat cabrito. And then they've got those wonderful Central Texas meat markets that were started by immigrants from Central Europe, Germans and Czechs. All of those had a hand in sort of creating this wonderful tradition of Texas barbecue that's kind of southern, but kind of a bunch of other stuff too. This sign was posted for years at Kreitz Market, one of those European meat marketplaces in Central Texas, in Lockhart, Texas. They always claimed their beef was so tasty that no one needed barbecue sauce. So they had that sign made. It's still hanging up there, no barbecue sauce, nothing to hide. That sign's kind of a lie now because about a year ago they started serving barbecue sauce, and it was a real big story in Texas. It was on the front page of newspapers there. It was all over the place that this place that proudly said our barbecue's so good we don't need sauce has started doing sauce, and what does that say about our traditions? One of the other places that's very identified with barbecue in America that it's spread to is, of course, Kansas City. This is Henry Perry, the acknowledged father of Kansas City barbecue. He was a steamboat cook from Memphis who settled in Kansas City around 1900 and started selling barbecue from a stand downtown. He trained the people who eventually founded the most famous barbecue places in town, Arthur Bryant's and Gates. As you can see from this 1915 ad, they barbecued a wider variety of meats back then. What do they got? They got possum, groundhog, mutton, coon. I love the Henry Perry story because barbecue is such an oral tradition and a lot of it's not written down that it's very difficult. It's very difficult to know sometimes where things actually started. Henry Perry in Kansas City training these people who started the most prominent barbecue restaurants there is it's where you can actually trace a story back to a father of Kansas City barbecue, and it's not that way in most places. In most places we're just kind of guessing and we don't really know. Before I go further with the geographical tour, people ask me, and I've written about whether Georgia has a particular barbecue style. And it does, but it's not as easy to characterize as brisket in Texas or wet and dry ribs in Memphis. The predominant style here in Georgia, particularly in the northern half of Georgia, is chopped pork shoulder or ham, served with a red sauce. It usually has a lot of cider vinegar, with a bowl of Brunswick stew. Brunswick stew, to me, is the most distinctive thing about barbecue in Georgia. You just don't find it as widespread in other barbecue places as you do in Georgia. It is a much bigger part of the tradition here. Now, that doesn't mean we invented it. This marker is at the Welcome Center on I-95 outside of Brunswick, Georgia, and it claims that the first pot of Brunswick stew was made in this pot on St. Simon's Island on July 2nd, 1898. And that claim is kind of a crock. Brunswick County, Virginia had been making Brunswick stew 90 years before this. And you know, Brunswick County, Virginia and Brunswick, Georgia have argued about this. I've written about it multiple times about who invented Brunswick stew. And it really doesn't matter that much because, in the long run, because Virginia, they've still got their stew traditions, but it's a much bigger thing here. It's much more of a pocket there. Here, it's a much more widespread thing. This is a ticket to the Harley Farmers Club barbecue last year. I went last August for the first time, as I mentioned. Until the late 1800s, the word barbecue almost always referred to a big event like this. Come on. There we go. That's just the serving line. I was shocked by how huge the the Harley Farmers Club barbecue was. I mean, there was a long line there. It was just, I kept thinking it was going to be like 40 people, but it was more like, what is it, 200, 300, 400 people? It's a big deal. But that is a real throwback event. That gives you a sense of what barbecue was in this country until well in the 20th century. It was a big event. If you go back like I have and look at the digitized accounts of barbecues in newspapers from the 1800s, almost all of them are about big events. They're church reunions, they're fraternal gatherings, they're reunions of Civil War soldiers. They are, above all, they're political rallies. Political rallies were the biggest excuse. Almost all, 80% of barbecue mentions in newspapers in the 1800s have to do with political gatherings. Now, one of the most unusual political gatherings, big event barbecues that ever happened in this country, happened in Atlanta. Let me explain. This is a postcard from 1909 for Billy Possum. William Howard Taft was elected president in 1908 and spent his time before he was inaugurated in the South, in the Bon Air Hotel in Augusta. And the people in Atlanta, the civic leaders, decided that it would be very smart to invite the president-elect to Atlanta for a big banquet. So they invited him, and they decided that the main event of the banquet was going to be barbecued possum. Now, the reason why is because teddy bears were the biggest toy in America right then. Theodore Roosevelt had famously refused to shoot a bear cub on a hunting trip in Mississippi, and the Ideal Toy Company got the idea of creating a teddy bear, and they were the rage. So when Taft got elected, the editorial cartoonist in America, ever clever, decided that he needed a mascot too. And because William Howard Taft was rotund, they decided that a possum was probably very fitting for him. So they came up with this character called Billy Possum. And the people in Atlanta decided with this Billy Possum thing afoot, we're going to serve the president-elect barbecued possum. So for 2 weeks, the Atlanta newspapers were full of stories about people going out around Georgia looking for the tastiest marsupial in the state. And they finally found the perfect possum in Coweta County. And they brought him back, they barbecued him, and they had the banquet in the Municipal Auditorium in downtown Atlanta, near where Georgia State is now. It had just been built. And there were like hundreds of people at this banquet, and they go pushing a cart with a chafing dish on it down the middle aisle to the president-elect's table, and they lift off the lid of the dish, and there's Billy Possum grinning up at the president-elect. And, you know, Taft was from Cincinnati, so he didn't know nothing about possums. But he gamely tried a bite and said it was okay. But in the weeks after that, people all around the country kept sending possum gifts to Taft, including on several occasions giving him live possums as a keepsake. And at one of these gatherings, he finally said, enough with the possum, I don't hanker for it. And the possum kind of died away. But you can still find these postcards on eBay. About 3/4 of American presidents have a direct connection to barbecue. Usually it's fundraising barbecues they held, or they went and campaigned at barbecue restaurants and tried to show what ordinary people they were. Of all the presidents we've had, the president who was most likely to actually fire up a grill was Eisenhower. Oh yeah. Probably because he was a career Army guy. He had to cook for himself a lot. Eisenhower loved to grill. If you go to see the show at the Atlanta History Center, we had on loan from the Ford Museum in Michigan the grill that Eisenhower used at his retirement home in Palm Springs after he left the White House. It's a really funny grill. It's a very high-end grill for its time. It's got charcoal, gas, and electricity, and it's called the General Electric Patio Cart. Patio. And you know, Palm Springs Life did a story about Eisenhower right after he left the White House, where there's several paragraphs where he's raving about this grill he's using. And I heard about how much Ike liked to grill, And I called up probably the most famous Secret Service agent there has been, Clint Hill, the guy who's well known for having climbed on the back of the limousine during the Kennedy assassination. About 5 years before that, he was on Eisenhower's personal security detail, and he saw Ike light up grills in Camp David, at his farm in Gettysburg, on the balcony of the White House, at his in-laws' house in Colorado. A lot of what he's doing isn't what a Southerner would call barbecue. He loved to grill steaks. He used to put the steaks down in the coals and sear them in the coals and cook them that way, and then bring them out and brush them off. And they would be, seared on the outside, a little charred, and then the inside they'd be juicy and pink. And I asked Clint Hill if he'd ever gotten to try one. He said, "Oh, no, I was the hired help." Our sense of what barbecue meant started to change around the turn of the 20th century, when barbecue restaurants started to open. Two of the earliest ones were in downtown Atlanta, a place called Verner's on Broad Street and a place called Willem's on Marietta Street. Barbecue places proliferated as more Americans took to the roads and cars during the 20s and 30s. Georgia's two oldest barbecue places started as roadside conveniences during this period. Sprayberry's in Newman, 1926, started as a gas station, and then the pork barbecue started out selling the gas and it became a barbecue restaurant. Fresh Air in Jackson started in 1929. Its name evokes the days when it really was just an open air stand. And they still sort of make homage to that if you go to Fresh Air, because there's a part of the restaurant that still is, you can eat outside and there's sawdust on the floor. And it's one of my favorite barbecue restaurants, Fresh Air. The city where I would say the barbecue restaurant really evolved most fully early on was Memphis. Barbecue places like Leonard's in Memphis started popping up in the 20s, and Leonard's was one of the first big famous barbecue places in America. It became a huge drive-in, very much like the Varsity. Probably not as big as the Varsity, but 2/3 that size, on the south side of Memphis. It was Elvis's favorite barbecue place in the 50s. He used to take the Memphis Mafia there after hours and have a barbecue party at noon, until the fans realized that if the lights were on at Leonard's after midnight, go there because you're probably going to see Elvis. And they stopped doing it. After that, they had to take it to Graceland. This sign is one of my favorite barbecue signs anywhere. You can't see it real well here, but the lettering right there. But it's a beautiful neon sign, and it says, "Mr. Brown goes to town." The pig is Mr. Brown. If you see him in his full glory, he's a strutting pig with the cane twirling, and Mr. Brown refers to the outside meat, the meat that's a little bit more cooked and has more seasoning on it. And people would go in here and to a lot of traditional barbecue places, and they would ask for a mixture of inside and outside meat, which is the tastiest thing, to mix those two things up. Leonard's is still there. It's got a lot of history. A lot of the early chain franchise restaurants in Atlanta in America were barbecue places. This is a menu from the Pig Stand. It was a barbecue chain that started in Texas in the 1920s. Their motto was "Eat a pig sandwich." And their menus looked like pigs, and they had about 200 locations in the 20s and 30s. Barbecue places really were more popular franchise operations in the 20s and 30s than hamburger stands. The place that really dramatizes the early days of franchising and how it later changed is McDonald's. The McDonald brothers started their first restaurant was in San Bernardino, California in 1942. And they served a lot of things, but if you look at a picture of their marquee, it says barbecue across it. It doesn't say burgers. And the first thing on their menu is barbecued spare ribs. I also love the little Scottish man saying, "Hoot mine." McDonald's, you probably know, they stayed as a barbecue drive-in with car hops for several years, and then in the late 40s they were retooled as they got rid of the car hops and they went from barbecue to hamburgers because hamburgers were faster. And they made it just a totally, they went from slow food to fast food and became something utterly different. But they started out as a barbecue place. Now, one of the big steps in barbecue becoming a nationwide phenomenon was the rise of backyard barbecue in the 20th century. We in this part of the country tend to think that everything about barbecue started in the South, but that isn't true. Backyard barbecuing actually started in California. This woodcut shows a couple standing in a brick pit. It comes from the first barbecue cookbook published by Sunset Magazine in 1938. Sunset was started in the 1890s by the Southern Pacific Railroad to promote tourism and migration to the West. They started marketing backyard cooking as part of the California lifestyle during the 20s, and their idea of barbecue didn't come from the South or Texas. It came from the Mexican ranch barbecues of the Southwest. It's a whole different branch of the barbecue family tree. Now, backyard cooking really took off after World War II when grills and smokers caught on nationally. And one of the best known was Weber's kettle, of course, in the 50s, which came out of Chicago. But there's actually a product from Georgia that predated Weber by about 5 years, the Charbroil grill from Columbus. Charbroil was an old foundry in Columbus that made wood stoves. Back during the Civil War, they made artillery for the Confederacy. And their wood stove business was completely dropping off by the 1930s and 40s. And after the war, they started making portable cookers. In the exhibition at the History Center, we've got one of the two remaining original Charbroil. They call it the picnic cooker. And it's a weird-looking thing. It's mid-evolution. It looks like a wheelbarrow with a round cooker attached to the top. It hasn't quite evolved into a backyard cooker that we would recognize, but it's clearly on the evolutionary scale. One of the other products that made backyard barbecue possible, is charcoal. Charcoal briquettes were patented in 1897 as a heating fuel, but they didn't become a barbecue staple until the Ford Motor Company started selling its own brand of charcoal during the 1930s. Ford had a lot of wood left over from building Model A's. There was a lot of wood in cars back then, and they didn't know what to do with it. And one of Ford's cousins, whose last name was Kingsford, came up with the idea of burning this down and making briquettes out of it. And in the 30s and 40s and well into the 50s, if you went into a Ford dealership, you could buy a Ford, it's almost like a little hibachi grill. The idea was that there weren't as many motels then, and a lot of people were still camping out in campgrounds. And you could cook your dinner on a Ford grill using Ford charcoal. And you can see the idea. There's the old car, there's the grill, and there's the charcoal. Between grills and charcoal and the growing number of barbecue cookbooks, barbecue truly became a national phenomenon during the 1950s. This is one of my favorite indicators that we use in the book of how barbecue had become sort of nationalized. This is a New Yorker cover from 1950. Probably, I'm thinking that that's a guy who runs his own financial firm in Wall Street. He's got the cigar chomp there, and he's got his servant pouring out the charcoal. I think he's at a big house in Connecticut or something. For all these grill meisters in other parts of the country who had no idea how to start a fire, there were a lot of really funny convenience products that came out in the 1950s. This is one of my favorite ones. It looks like shaving cream, or Agent Orange or something. And but yeah, this came out in the late 50s, and it's an accelerant that was supposed to help you start your fire. With the rising, spreading popularity of barbecue, came the rise of barbecue condiments. Barbecue sauces had appeared in cookbooks since the early 1800s, but the first known commercial bottled sauce was made in downtown Atlanta in 1909 by the Georgia Barbecue Sauce Company. And the oldest brand on the market today is Mrs. Griffin's out of Macon which dates to 1935. There are hundreds of barbecue sauces out there, and I think they're a really important part of barbecue lore. Many celebrities have put out their own brand. Back in the 90s, Richard Petty had his own brand of barbecue sauce. He is a North Carolinian, after all. This growing interest in barbecue during the post-war decades didn't stop with sauce. Starting in the 1950s, the very flavor of barbecue started popping up in all sorts of consumer products like barbecue potato chips and this monstrosity from 1964. There are several of those. There's like, back in the early 60s, there were ads for ribs in a can, barbecued Spam, just horrible barbecue sauces you made with like Hunt's tomato sauce and Wesson oil. It's a little bit painful to see the ways that the advertisers and magazines back then were trying to sell barbecue to the parts of the country where it didn't come naturally. Fortunately, people got more sophisticated about barbecue as time went on and they got more exposed to it. One of the most fun parts of writing Smokelore was examining all the ways barbecue has popped up in our culture, in our literature, our art, our movies, our television. The Simpsons has dealt with barbecue at least in half a dozen episodes. Usually some joke about Homer starting a grill and blowing up the neighborhood, or not knowing how to build and put together a grill or something like that. Barbecue has figured in movies from Giant, Gone with the Wind, to Fried Green Tomatoes, and Boys in the Hood. It's been alluded to in the writings of Mark Twain, William Faulkner, Eudora Welty, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, and somewhat surprisingly, Raymond Chandler. But the art that's most identified with barbecue is music, especially blues and jazz, where barbecue used to be slang for a good-looking woman. In one of Louis Armstrong's first big hits, Struttin' with Some Barbecue, he was definitely not talking about walking down the street with a slab of ribs. Two Atlanta barbecue drive-ins played a role in music lore. At Tidwell's in Buckhead on Peachtree Road, a talent scout discovered an employee who was singing the blues working there. His name was Robert Hicks. He was promptly christened Barbecue Bob, and he was made to pose with his butcher smock and his restaurant cap and his guitar. And he was a very popular blues man for about 5 years in the early 30s until he died very, very young of tuberculosis. His signature song is called Barbecue Blues. I've listened to it numerous times. It's all about a woman walking out on him. There's no mention of barbecue in it. It's just because he was working at Tidwell's and therefore he had to be Barbecue Bob. One of the other places with Georgia connections that's very associated with music is the Pig and Whistle, a barbecue chain that started in Georgia and had locations in Macon and Albany and Augusta and 2 of them in Atlanta. This ad is from the Atlanta Constitution in 1928, advertising the opening of a Pig and Whistle barbecue on Peachtree Road. I've looked it up in the city directories. There's a Benihana there now. The barbecue place that was actually, the Pig and Whistle that was more famous for its music connections in Atlanta was the Pig and Whistle on Ponce de Leon, pretty close to where Mary Mac's is. It's where the Krispy Kreme donut shop is down there now. In fact, the Krispy Kreme is actually in the building that was Pig and Whistle from the late 20s until 1962 or 3 when it closed. But that Pig and Whistle is very known because the most famous bluesman who ever came out of Georgia played for Tips down there, Blind Willie McTell, author of Statesboro Blues. Blind Willie played for Tips at the Pig and Whistle in Atlanta during the 30s. He did well there. For a while, the Pig and Whistle chain had him playing at Pig and Whistles all over Georgia and South Carolina. There were a few years there in the 30s that he actually didn't call himself Blind Willie McTell. His records actually say Pig and Whistle Red. One of the things that fascinated me about barbecue and its history is how so many larger stories of American life are reflected in it. Gender roles, immigration, suburbanization, commercialization, and of course race. Some people, when they heard I was working on this book, asked me whether black people invented barbecue. And that's, of course, a loaded question, but it's a fair and important one. And my answer is that this tradition has many authors from numerous ethnic groups with roots on 5 continents. So you can't say that one group of people invented barbecue. But let's be honest, African Americans are so identified with barbecue, and they cooked so much of it when it was really taking root in the plantation days in the southern Atlantic colonies. They're so identified with it in positive and negative ways that it kind of seems like they invented it, even if they didn't. They're just very, it's just part of their culture in this country. I've always thought that the 2 ethnic groups that are most associated with barbecue are black and white Southerners. And that's why I find this photo so interesting. This is a photo from the late 1930s. It's a Library of Congress photo showing a barbecue on a plantation near Eufaula, Alabama. It's called the F.M. Gay Plantation. And as you can see in that photo, there are black people literally getting their barbecue on one side of the wall and white people on the other side. I've seldom seen a picture, certainly not one that has to do with barbecue, that so dramatically shows racial segregation like that. And of course the irony of all that is that these are 2 populations that had almost an equal passion and love for barbecue and a great knowledge and expertise with it. But there were still customs and laws that sort of governed how they were to enjoy it. A quarter of a century later, in 1964, barbecue restaurants played an important role in litigating the Civil Rights Act. Some of y'all probably remember Maurice Bessinger. He had a brand of mustard barbecue sauce. It was real popular for years, Carolina Gold mustard sauce, out of Columbia, South Carolina. He had a restaurant there called Piggy Park. It's still there that his sons run. Maurice got into trouble a few years ago for putting a rebel flag on the labels of his barbecue sauce. And as sensibilities changed, his products started to get boycotted, and then Walmart, under pressure, dropped them. Maurice had actually been campaigning for Confederate values for many years. He was one of 2 barbecue restaurants that challenged the '64 Civil Rights Act. The other one was Ollie's in Birmingham. And the other restaurant famously that did it was Lester Maddox's Fried Chicken restaurant near Georgia Tech in Atlanta. It's interesting because Maurice and Ollie, the barbecue guys, they lost their case, but they stayed open. Maurice's is still open. Ollie's was open for another 30 years. Lester, of course, closed his place immediately and ran for governor. But it wasn't just white barbecue places, a handful of them who were resisting the law. There were people on the other side who were for the law, who were campaigning in their own way for change. There were several black barbecue places in Montgomery and Selma that are well known for feeding activists and protesters. And then a barbecue place I remember well from Atlanta, it's no longer there anymore, was called Alex Barbecue Heaven. It used to be on Hunter Street. Hunter was later changed to Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, and it was a neat sort of urban rib shack. The building and the pit were actually constructed from cobblestones that used to pave Hunter Street. And it was very close to where Martin Luther King Jr. lived. And this was his favorite place, and he used to go there for ribs. I interviewed Andrew Young for the book, and he told me that King used to go there and get ribs, and he said he was kind of joking, but he said, I think he wrote some of his best speech after he'd eaten those ribs, because you can't eat a big greasy meal like that and not sit up late thinking about it. Well, after King was assassinated, the people who knew him well at Alex, they made the back booth at the restaurant sort of a shrine to him. And it had that portrait of King hanging up back there. This photo, you can tell from the Atlanta magazine covers, it's from about 1993 or 4. I ate at Alex several times, and I always felt like you had to have special permission to go back there and sit at the table, to sit at this booth. And I asked the woman who ran it after Alec died, his daughter, Pamela Alexander, I said, did you regard this as a holy place and a shrine, and a little boy like me wasn't supposed to go there and sit? And she said, yeah, that's about it. I had to invite you to sit at that booth, and she never did. So. But Alex was a wonderful place. Like a lot of great barbecue places that we remember so fondly, Alex did not endure. It closed in 2000. A few years later, this barbecue place in Atlanta, which was probably the most beloved white-owned barbecue place, although it drew a very mixed clientele, Harold's Barbecue in South Atlanta. Harold's was down there near the federal penitentiary. It was just up the street from the General Motors Lakewood plant where my father and my brother Chuck worked for many years. When my barbecue sauce book came out in 1995 and CNN wanted to interview me, we did the interview at Harold's. Not because Harold's was necessarily the best barbecue in Atlanta. I didn't really think it was, but it was a beautiful atmosphere inside. It had the knotty pine and the red checkered tablecloths and the religious things and political things, and there was such a mixture of like white-collar lawyers and blue-collar people, and it was just, I knew it would make the perfect backdrop for them talking to me about barbecue sauce on CNN. Well, Harold's closed in 2012. And this picture is one that I made about 3 years ago showing the shell of the building there now. The people who own the property let me and a couple of other folks go inside and look around. And it's kind of sad. The copper thieves have come and stripped some of the stuff. There's some water damage. It looks bad in there. But when we walked into the pit room, it still smelled like lunch. I've noticed that barbecue lovers tend to be very sentimental and a little stubborn about barbecue. Like Ralph McGill, they usually think that the barbecue of today isn't as good as the idealized barbecue that they remember. Well, I'm here to tell you that the sentimentalists are wrong. In the past 10 or 20 years, I believe American barbecue has undergone a rebirth and is probably better than it's ever been. There's several reasons for this. I'll run through them real quickly. One is the competition circuit. Barbecue contests started in the late 1950s with the Kaiser Aluminum Cook-Off, a ritzy affair that was held in a Hawaiian resort. The MC at one of the early installments was the actress Joan Crawford. This was a very different sort of barbecue scene. The barbecue contest as we know it today didn't really take shape until the early 1970s and into the 80s. The definitive barbecue contest is probably Memphis in May. It started in 1978. This is a poster for it. I forget which year that is, but I love that poster. I've been to Memphis in May several times. It is the biggest and booziest contest. There are thousands of barbecue contests across the country now, and they spawned many of the best new barbecue restaurants and helped drive an interest in traditional barbecue methods. So I think they're an important reason for this rebirth in traditional barbecue. Another reason is the trend toward craft barbecue among chefs and young people. They have rediscovered old-fashioned barbecue in the same way that they've rediscovered coffee and bourbon and a bunch of other American classic tastes. This is Aaron Franklin, the star of the craft movement. His restaurant, Franklin Barbecue in Austin, Texas, is probably the most celebrated barbecue place in America. 4 years ago, he became the first barbecue man to win a James Beard Foundation Award as best chef in his region, beating out all the other the quasi-French chefs and the quasi-Italian chefs. He was in a general competition and a barbecue man beat them. And in the barbecue community, that was a really big deal. He was followed 2 years later by this man who also won a James Beard Award for barbecue, Rodney Scott of South Carolina. He is the hottest thing in barbecue since Aaron Franklin. We've got one of his burn barrels at the exhibition in Atlanta. It's a big, taller than me, it's a big sheet metal barrel where he burns hardwood down into the embers that he then shovels out to cook his whole hog. And it's really good stuff. He's opened a location in Charleston now, and I understand he's going to open a location in Birmingham, which I want to know why he leapfrogged Atlanta. The final factor I'd point to in the rebirth of barbecue is globalization. The growing interest here in international styles of grilling and barbecuing, and the growing international interest in American styles. There's a lot of cross-fertilization going on. I counted up a couple of years ago, and there's something like 300 restaurants in the greater Atlanta area. I mean, the Atlanta area is defined by the census, which includes Bartow County and goes to the Alabama border, so it takes in 28 counties. There are like 300 restaurants that identify as barbecue. I'll bet you a third of them are Asian. They're Korean barbecue places and things like that. I got a glimpse of this phenomenon firsthand a couple of years ago when I went to the Jack Daniels cook-off in Lynchburg, Tennessee, and met this gentleman. This is a young man from Nigeria named Korede Alini. He had won a grilling contest in Africa, and the first prize was a trip to the Jack in Lynchburg, Tennessee. It's this big oversized airplane ticket there. And I tell you what, he was very giddy to be there. They have native cooking, grilling and smoking traditions in Nigeria, but he was so enamored with American barbecue and kind of the mystique and reputation of it that he wanted to come over here and experience it. And I think that there's just a lot of interest right now in the way people do this kind of food around the world. Because of all these factors, I'm very optimistic about the future of barbecue. Maybe it won't look like this Sunday magazine cover from 1956 imagined it. This was a Hearst Sunday magazine, 1956. They were showing you what the future is going to look like, and you can see their barbecue there. It looks like something George Jetson would be cooking for his family. But whatever forms barbecue takes in the future, I think the tradition is stronger now than it ever has been in the 500 years since the flame was first kindled in the New World. The photo that you walked in on here is the author photo from a book. That sign is in the exhibition at the History Center. That's one of my favorite neon barbecue signs. It was for the Auburn Avenue Rib Shack. It was down there for decades on Auburn Avenue, just down from Ebenezer Baptist Church on the edge of downtown. I walked over there on their last day of business in 1994, and they had to stand in a long line. And then, much to my relief, after they closed, the History Center got that sign, restored it, kept it in storage at the museum. And then when this barbecue exhibition came about years later, we were sitting in a meeting, and somebody said, "Jim, we need to have a really great neon sign to put as a centerpiece of the exhibition." And I said, "Well, Leonard's is still using theirs in Memphis, and I think Big Bob Gibson is using his in Decatur, and those are two of my favorites. But you've got one of my all-time favorites in your basement here. Let's get it out, dust it off, and put it up." And we did. I'll be happy to take any questions or hear any comments or just talk about barbecue if you've got any. Thank you.